for all of us, it would be interesting to get a little bit more on your background, because I think that sets up this conversation well, to put it in perspective where your mind's coming from and how you're thinking about things, specifically in the world of technology. So maybe you can just give a quick intro. Where did you grow up, and what led you to start the first company at the age of 12?
So, like, I always like to begin this where I was born because it's kind of an awesome story. My mom was at Disneyland, and her water broke, and they put her in a little electric ambulance and drove her across the street to a hospital called Martin Luther that they tore down to build California Adventure. So I am actually from Disneyland. And I love that because it sort of outlines the craziness of my life. Like it's just a crazy origin story. I grew up for a bunch of years in Southern California. My dad was officially a defense contractor. He worked in the intelligence services as well. We had an internet connection before most people knew you could connect a computer to anything.
We're talking 70s,
right?
Having an internet connection.
I lived back east for a while in D.C. in a place called McLean, Virginia, at the end of the CIA access road. I always had these twin loves of technology and music. I had an early synthesizer called a Jupiter 8 that at that time cost an enormous amount of money. It was my dad's way of rewarding me for not being around in my life, is he would just bring me these crazy expensive toys, and then I would like join rock bands and play in them.
But take us back. Wow, take us back to the moment. Like rewind as a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
Starting a BBS board.
Oh, this is way before 12, but yeah.
Online, like what got you there? Like
so
what
had
to be in place?
It's actually where I was going. So I had this Jupiter 8, and then I got in trouble for using my dad's computer to download ASCII pictures of submarines and nuclear missile silos.
You still have those pictures?
And so the FBI came in their cheap shoes and suits and got very upset, and then gave my dad a talking to, and they said, listen, we've seen this before. Because my dad was like, I'm going to ground him, I'm going to lock him in his room, and they said, yeah, good luck with that. Listen, we don't care about any of that. What we do care about is buy him his own computer, and then you need to physically lock your computer in a room he can't get access to, which he still will, and you need to change your password every week. And my dad's like, I'm not rewarding him. And they said, listen, we've seen this before. The only solution is to give him his own path to do these things that isn't on your secure, agency provided machine. And so that's what he did. He bought me a Commodore 64. And on the back of that computer was a little 5-pin DIN port. It said MIDI. I didn't know what MIDI was. There was no internet, so I had to go to the library. I eventually discovered this was musical instrument digital interface. It was a new standard for connecting computers and keyboards. And so my dad then bought me this Jupiter 8 synthesizer, and it also had a DIN port on the back of it. So I went to Radio Shack and bought a cable and plugged. Nothing happened. And that is how that journey began, is I was on a quest to find things to do with a computer and a synthesizer hooked together. I wrote my first sequencer, which was a thing for making music. I wrote my first synthesizers. And then I started realizing there were places you could dial up and download software and sounds for the synthesizer using your computer. And eventually it was costing my parents a lot of money. So I set up the BBS so I could get other people to give me the software for free, and I could charge money for other people to download.
That sounds like another legal thing to do.
All very legal. I also discovered some of the people in the time would secure their software using encryption. So I learned how to crack that encryption, and then, helpfully provide demonstration copies of software like, early copies of Adobe and other software that people might want to evaluate before purchasing.
So was that what the BBS was about? It was
yes.
Like demonstration software?
So does anyone here know what WARES is? WAREZ. That's going to make all the...
One person.
Yeah, so all the millennials do that whole using Z's and the wrong letters at the end of things, we started that. So WARES was software which had the encryption removed so you could evaluate it ostensibly before purchase, but many people chose not to purchase. And I ran this and actually made a good living and bought most of my gear, my guitars, my keyboards, my car from the money from this BBS. And then when my band got signed and I ran away from home, I sold the BBS. And by the way, the BBS's name was called the 818. And my mom knew nothing about computers, but a lot about 12-year-old boys. So she had one rule. She's like, you can do whatever you want on your computer, no porn. So when you logged into the 818, it said, welcome to the 818. In like the biggest font available, it said no porn. Now, as a 12-year-old, I didn't know that the porn industry was based in the 818 area code. I chose the 818 because I thought it'd make it harder for the FBI and the police to figure out that I was actually in the 714. So the guy who bought it from me moved it to the 818 area code, put porn on it, and was promptly arrested 6 months later.
Wow. That was the biggest business online, I guess. But that computer, like the first technology experience, got you like to feed your second passion, which has been music, or maybe first in that moment. It was really
probably the first one. I mean, I consider myself a musician first and a nerd distant second or third. Like computers were my playground. Music was my craft.
But in your teenage, that's where you went all in. Like, what was the draw for you to music?
I was always a musician. I played the cello from age 4. I'm very musical. I love music. I love being in bands. It's funny because my teacher was Yo-Yo Ma's teacher, and he really wanted me to become a professional cello player. And I just wanted to play rock and roll. And I was in a whole bunch of bands. Because I had this great gear, I could sort of, at 13 or 14, I was playing in bars in Orange County. Like they'd put a hat on me and like put like something on my face so it looked like I had a beard, and I'd like go and play at these like bars. But eventually I was in a band that was signed to a label. We were a metal band. We were absolutely beautiful. We were terrible. All of my bandmates were serious heroin addicts, and I was a coke addict. So I was sort of the odd man out in that they were all falling asleep in the studio, and I was like ready to work till 4 a.m. And so I ran away from home because my parents were not supportive of this, and we mixed this record. We put it out. It wasn't very good. We went on tour where in the rock and roll days, like there was even more drugs and less responsibility on tour. And by the time we got to New York and played our very last show at CBGB's, where no one showed up except our girlfriends and one dude we met at the bodega down the street, we got dropped. And the label dropped us 3 days later, which was my 18th birthday. And I was kicked out of the band the next day because there was a band meeting. It's probably the best thing that ever happened to me. And so
why do you see it as the best thing that happened to you at the moment?
The story was like I got kicked out of the band. Remember, I'm emancipated, so I'm alone. I had a little tiny apartment in Hollywood. It's like not a very nice apartment. And I had a girlfriend who was a freshman at UCLA. I went to her dorm room to like cry on her shoulder, and she said, "You're too smart to be a rock star. You should go to college." So I dumped her. So now I'm single, unemployed, marginally about to be homeless. Mm-hmm. And I was like, after a week or two, I was like, I probably should go to college. So I went on a journey to go to a bunch of schools.
And where did you didn't leave music at all. You were even more amassed in the music business and music industry after that. Yeah, I mean, the college thing is interesting. I dropped out of 6 colleges, five colleges 6 times. I started and ended at UCSB, but in between I went to Berklee School of Music, Museum School of Art, and Tufts. My specific focus was always the apex of technology and art. I was really, really interested in that. There was a thing called a synclavier, which was this like music computer system that was like a mainframe. I helped write part of something called a VAST, which is a VAX mainframe music system written by this French woman named Kachera Morin, who was my professor. And she was dyslexic like me, so I was the only sysadmin who could make it work because I understood how her brain worked because mine was the same. And it's like, I probably would have ended up working for Kurzweil or something. But I happened to meet a couple of the Beach Boys living in Santa Barbara, and I helped build their recording studios. That was one of my later businesses, was building recording studios. And they invited me to go on tour with them. Wow. So you went from your own band, dropped rock bottom, to touring with Beach Boys. Yeah, I mean, it was a slow, I was paying for, because I was on my own. So I was paying for school by working at this like Guitar Center kind of place in Santa Barbara. And then I started building these recording studios. That was this early moment of MIDI created this opportunity where before the 80s, if you were a songwriter, you would write a bunch of songs using pen and paper or a piano and a tape recorder, and then you'd go spend $100,000 for a week of studio time to make a demo, and then hope to God you sold one of the songs to get that money back. And suddenly you'd hire me for $20,000. I'd build you a home studio for $20,000, and you could make as many songs in it as you wanted using all this technology that I understood that most people didn't understand. And so that's how that happened. The Beach Boys, I built all their studios, and then they're like, he's kind of useful to have around. We should take him on tour with us. And that is what led you to another industry first. Your pioneering journey continues to the first digitally recorded album. Yeah, it's true. So I worked for the Beach Boys. We toured all over the world. It was
at the peak of my drug addiction. So I was taking all the amazing money I was making and snorting it up my nose or drinking it. But the Beach Boys are amazing. And they came off tour and they had just had this hit for Kokomo. Right before I went on tour with them, they recorded Kokomo. And so they were like, we should do a new record. And I met Keith Wexler, who's this famous recording engineer, and he and I were going to mix the record. And we rented a house in Carmel next to Terry Melcher, who was the producer. I lived with Doris Day for a while, his mom. That was awesome. She had 50 dogs. She was awesome. I loved her. She was bonkers, but she was awesome. She would make me breakfast every day. But and we recorded this record, and the Beach Boys, this is a little secret I can reveal now because they're either dead or broken up in a way they can't sue me. So the secret to the Beach Boys hits is that they use tape splices for the choruses of the song. If everyone knows what a chorus is, so like there's a verse, there's a chorus. So they would basically get a perfect chorus, and then they would tape splice a copy of that, so it's always the same. So the hook was perfect. And so when they explained this to me, I was like, you want me to use a razor blade to edit tape? I'm not doing that. It sounded really hard and like a lot of work. It's going to impair my ability to consume drugs. So I showed them Pro Tools, which I had a beta copy of on my Mac. And it was this experimental software. It was not released. I, of course, had removed the encryption of it from downloading it from, at that time, the internet.
Decided not to buy.
And so they said, they got all excited. And the problem with working for famous people who are rich is they get excited about something and their vision for what you can do with it far exceeds what you can actually do with it. So they're like, let's do the whole record on Pro Tools. And I was like, that's not going to work on my Mac Plus. Like, this is like, you can't put, there's only 4 tracks. Like, I know Sgt. Pepper's was recorded on 4 tracks, but there's not even preamps for this, right? So, but I thought, all right, this is actually the best part of the story. So I had to do something. So I was like, okay, so I called Apple. So I called up the DigiDesign guys, who are all famous VCs now. But at that time, they were like DigiDesign. They're like a starving startup in Silicon Valley. And I said, hey, I work for the Beach Boys, blah, blah, blah. We want to use this on an album. Is that possible? They said, we're working on a 16-track version, but it only runs on Macintosh prototype hardware called a Quadra, which only exists as a prototype. So if you can get Apple to give you the hardware, we'll give you the software for free. We'll even assign a tech to you. And remember, we're in Carmel recording. So I'm like, this is easy. So I cold called Steve Jobs' office. Cold call. I reach his assistant, which is, that in itself is kind of a small miracle. This woman thinks I'm crazy, but I keep talking. And eventually she's like, hold on. She puts me on hold and Steve Jobs picks up. And
amazing.
He's like, you work for the Beach Boys. I go, yeah. And he starts punching me all these questions, trying to trap me in that I don't really work for the Beach Boys. I'm like, look, do you want to talk to Mike Love? He's right here. He's like, this long pause, and I hand the phone to Mike Love. Mike Love, and his voice is like unmistakable. He's like, hey, who's this? Steve, nice to meet you. So can you give us some of these computers? A week later, we go to Il Fornaio in Palo Alto, and we have dinner with Steve Jobs, most of the executive board of Apple. I don't know that Steve's about to be fired, but that hasn't happened yet. And they agree to give us, I think, one of the first people to ever have outside hardware that weren't like developers. Mm-hmm. And we recorded the record using Pro Tools for the very first album ever recorded. And it didn't work. The time code would break. It was like a spectacularly bad idea, but it was amazing.
That's incredible. Another first. But how did music business in that time you've shared was a bit crazy in every way, not just, how and technology and how you were kind of approaching and running that, but also the lifestyle of being in the music business that took you to the depth. Yeah,
here's what I would say. When you live on airplanes, tour buses, never sleeping in the same house, you're rootless, right? And money is everywhere. Drugs are everywhere. Alcohol's everywhere. The culture at that time was very much if you did 2, I did 3. And remember, I'm young. So I'm in my 20s. Most of the people working for the Beach Boys are in their 40s or 50s. They're lifers. And they did not want this kid. No one liked me. When I would show up to gigs, they'd be like, you are too young. Let's get an adult in here. And then I'd start talking, and then I'd start mixing, and then I'd just do it, and they'd go, okay, you can stay. But they really didn't like me. So if you did a shot, I had to do 2. If you did a line, I had to do 3. I had to show that I was tough and I could hang. And that was fine for a while, but eventually breakfast was a shot of tequila and a line of Coke. And that was my life for a good 10 years. And eventually I left the Beach Boys. I ran a small record label, which we sold to David Geffen. I moved to LA, worked for a bigger label. But at this point, I was sort of like leaving Las Vegas. Like I was a hot mess. And the label, as useful and good as I was at my job, they eventually fired me, and I didn't even notice for like 2 weeks.
Wow.
Like they'd give me a severance package and lock me out of the office, and I didn't know. Like I tried to get in the office one night to do something, and I couldn't get in, and that was how I found out I'd been fired. And then I went through my mail and found the severance package. And and I was like, oh, they fired me. Oh, I can. Yeah. And then July 5th, 33 years ago, this July, I woke up and I was like, I'm going to stay dry for a week and see if that helps, because nothing seems to be going my way.
But what was the trigger? Like, how do you, in that depth where you're like, you're fired, you're deep in it, like, how do you pick yourself back up in that moment and say, like,
well, three things happened.
Together.
My bottom as an addict was a pretty high bottom. Like I wasn't robbing people, I wasn't hooking or doing anything like that. But I did have a fling with someone deeply inappropriate. It was my roommate's underage sister. I rode my motorcycle through the hills of Silver Lake with her on the back, and I don't have any memory of doing this. That's how loaded I was. And then I woke up in the morning and I just looked in the mirror and I was like, I'm an asshole. And I want to not be an asshole for a bit. That was the moment. Then the scary moment was a day later when I started detoxing. And I don't know if anyone here has ever seen a movie about detoxing. It's way worse than that. It's way worse than that. And I didn't know I had a problem until then. And then I very seriously knew I had a problem. And once you have that moment of clarity, 3 or 4 days later, I was like, I'm done. I'm going to live. I want to live, and I don't want to be in the 2700 Club. So we're going to change strategies. And that meant leaving music, because at that time, the music business was impossible without drugs and alcohol. Like today, half people in the music business are sober, but in those days, you couldn't get a meeting. So
we are getting back deep into technology.
Yeah.
Complete change of course.
I had one fungible skill other than doing drugs and making music, which is computers. I knew a lot about computers.
And what did you see in that moment when you were like, I'm going to go all in with internet, early stage?
Well, internet came a little later. At first, I was literally like, as I got sober, I needed to make money. I snorted all my money up my nose or shot up my veins. And so I became this sort of independent IT guy that record execs would pay money and free CDs and vinyl to get their computers on the internet. Because in those days, like Capitol Records IT department was like, they knew the internet existed. They wanted nothing to do with it.
Sure.
And so I would go, you get a fax line. I would hack the operating kernel in like Windows or Mac and like set up a modem so that you could get your computer on the internet and see the web, which was this new thing. And I became kind of famous for that. And every Hollywood music and film executive knew me because I was like the guy who could like figure out the security protocols in the IT software. And that was how it began. And then I went to work at a movie company making video games. That was kind of amazing. And we made 3 video games that were all held up as paragons of the anti-virtue by Tipper Gore on the Senate floor. One which involved Playboy. It was like investigating nude murders. And then I had a friend, Charles Como, who started this web developer. He made a lot of money. And I was like, Charles isn't very smart. I'm way smarter than Charles. So he wanted me to go work for him. Instead, I set up a company with my friend Steven Anspaugh, who was the manager of the Viper Room. And Steven also, like me, was a secret nerd. And our goal was to not work for assholes. That's literally like our original mission statement was don't work for assholes. And that company became Razorfish.
So that was Tag Media.
Yeah. Yeah.
And very quickly, like just 2 years later.
A year later, we went from
merged
3 people to 30 people to 300 people to 10,000 people.
Wow. So that was the rocket ship moment for you. What do you...
Yeah, we merged. We were acquired by Omnicom. The company called Razorfish was also acquired by them.
Yes.
Omnicom then merged us all together. There's a whole long rollicking tale. Razorfish has, I jokingly say, 13 founders and no mother.
But what did you see in that moment, like that you went so all in into the media world at the time and building,
so it's great
things on the internet?
When I was doing Tag Media, which became Razorfish, we were really systems integrators. We weren't really, I just happened to be from LA. So I always joke, I've been painted with this media brush and done these amazing media jobs all my life, but I'm just the nerd who happened to be from LA. So I understood media, but it wasn't like, I was, I guess, an artist. So I am this weird thing, but I always thought of myself as a technologist, not as an artist. And Razorfish only became a media company a decade after I left. Omnicom bought us, but we hated them. We tried to buy a McKinsey. We thought we were like, and we actually were. I mean, Tal will tell us that we were as good as McKinsey, I think, in those early days. You know.
Where was there a moment? Because like I think.
So the answer to the question is, I was just doing what I'd always done, which is having that natural curiosity and exploring new things and talking to people and surprising them with like my intelligence and my understanding of transformation in a way most people don't live with transformation very well. They don't like it. And I love it.
How many of you are entrepreneurs here building your own businesses?
Yeah.
Probably like, more than half.
I'm sorry, there's no cure.
But the question to you is like, when building that, like looking back, it seems like this amazing rocket ship that took off from the first day. So I'm sure like there's moments for you when you're, almost out of business.
Oh yeah.
Not clear what we're doing. Like, how do you find those opportunities? Like you clearly have an eye for them, not just technologists in the market. I'm like,
True story. 2 weeks before we sold to Razorfish. So we had a government contract. We built NASA's website and we had this government contract, and government contracts are amazing because like they always pay. They're terrible because they pay super slowly and any number of things can stop the check for up to a year. So NASA owed us about $180,000 and they'd been pretty good about sending a $30,000 check roughly every month. And then for 2 months, no check came. And the thing is, every employee I hired cost me a $5,000 in a computer purchase and a $1,000 desk and chair. So I had a $7,000 advance cash requirement for every single employee, and I was growing at 10 employees a month. And so my wife, she was my fiance, and my girlfriend, going to my fiance, we were going to the mobile gas store for groceries because that was the only credit card I had that wasn't maxed. My net worth on paper is millions. My net worth in my bank account was, I was bouncing checks regularly. And I was like, we have to sell this thing. I need a big brother. We literally couldn't eat. And then Razorfish, I had a bidding war between Razorfish and 3 other agencies, and Razorfish won or lost depending on how you look at it. And when they bought the company, suddenly I had $1 million in my bank account. They sent it to my checking account. So I went from like literally the mobile gas card. I woke up 2 days later and I was like, there's too many zeros when I did the ATM receipt. It's just zeros. There was the one was missing because it didn't go that.
What was the life like being part of a larger group or larger company when you're no longer the only one in control? So
it's funny. Agencies, and I just joined. I have to public service announcement. I just yesterday was announced I'm a non-exec director of an agency called Manifest, which is one of the sexiest agencies in the world.
Won the agency of the year, I think.
Yeah, they're amazing. They hunted me down. I turned them down. They didn't take no for an answer. Alex is so persistent and lovely, and I'm super glad I listened because they are as close to Razorfish in culture, which is they just have a vision and a sharpness to them, which is what I loved about Razorfish. So when I joined Razorfish, first of all, it was like a few hundred people who were exactly like me, which I had never experienced that before. The second thing is everyone had good ideas and we were very collaborative and we were very independent. I ran LA and I owned everything in LA and I had an earnout, which meant no one could mess with me. And San Francisco was doing pretty good, but they didn't have the leadership we had, but they had more formal like enterprise sales experience. So we became really close, and SF and LA would collaborate a lot on projects and share resources. And we kind of didn't behave like a big agency, but what I got was the ability to access resources, talent, and big clients because we had a brand. And I learned all these things about going to market at scale. Instead of begging for a $50,000 or $100,000 project, we would walk into American General Financial Group and say, we don't work for less than $10 million. And they would pay. And I learned that the $10 million client sent their wire without question, and the $50,000 client would make you have 6 meals to give you the $5,000 advance payment. And that was a very big lesson of you want to be playing in a different league. The other thing I learned is how to build and retain talent. I mean, we had this problem at Razorfish, which is everyone was 24 to 30. Mm-hmm. Half the people had dropped out of college. Where do you get your middle management from? You can't put an ad on the internet or on the newspaper and say, I'm looking for someone with 10 years experience in the internet. The internet wasn't 10 years, the web wasn't 10 years old. So it had to be one of the people who already worked there. And how do you turn these people into leaders when they've been totally conditioned up till that point to the opposite of leadership?
How did you yourself become that leader? Because clearly, like, your journey on from Razorfish to then, large corporates like BBC and later leading the Daily Mail, like, you as a leader, how did you grow in that moment?
So it's interesting. I think
as a nerd specifically.
Yeah. And as a young person trying to impress people, before I was sober, I did it through extreme behavior. Once I got sober, I had to learn ways to influence and lead that didn't involve extreme behavior. And so, all my life I've been a fish out of water. Like when I made movies, I'd never been in a movie set when I produced my first movie. When I produced my first record, I'd never been in a recording studio to do that. So I was always where I shouldn't be. And I learned quickly to listen and adapt and really understand the human sides of the problem. Because the technical things, there's almost always someone who can do that for you. Mm-hmm. But it's the listening and the judgment. I mean, one of my favorite interviews is the Rick Rubin thing that's running around. It is exactly my path. Was like, my job was judgment, collaboration, problem solving, and often to get out of the way of the super talented people to do what they were great at, mm-hmm. and enable and protect those special moments. And then to choose, like a gardener, what to prune. Like a BBC, probably the most successful thing I did at the BBC is something no one can see, which is I joined the BBC with a guy named Eric Huggers, who was the CIO of the BBC. And we were the two foreigners running digital. I mean, that's actually, I thought that we met at the KINN, but then like 6 months ago, we realized we met at this time.
That's right, yeah.
He worked for a dear friend of mine.
And now time you're in London.
Yeah, so I'm in London. I'm an American running the digital for the BBC. I'm vaguely becoming famous because I say things that upset people. But I joined the BBC, and they had 280 work streams across all different platforms, satellite TV, internet. They had like 57 video players. One shaped like a crisp. That's a potato chip. And I unified all those into something called iPlayer, which was a Flash streaming thing, which was hugely controversial. And also using Flash there was a bunch of things I did, but also what we did is we did these processes where instead of me just deciding to do something, I held these events on Fridays at 4 p.m., which in a public service organization is no one goes to work it. So I was like, anyone can come and we're going to review all the projects. Mm-hmm. And I made this committee, and it was 13 people, including me. And I said, I'm not voting. So 6 from editorial and 6 from product and technology and design, whatever. And the editorial this community would vote on what lived and what died. And I was the tiebreaker. So if it was 6 versus 6, then I got to choose. And I said, my goal is to never vote. Mm-hmm. That's how I know I've done this correctly. And the guy at the time who ran news hated me. He went to every meeting. He brought his notebooks. He had very strong opinions about lots of things that had nothing to do with news. But over time, we took those 200 projects into these incredible work streams where we launched iPlayer, the first streaming service, a year before Hulu.
The most successful streaming service in the UK, for sure.
Probably in the world if you did it per capita.
At the time, for sure.
We launched the very first mobile service on BlackBerry, and then WAP, which was, again, revolutionary. The idea of using your mobile phone on the network, impossible. We built not 1, not 2, but 3 satellite TV services that even today are the technical stacks used by 90% of satellite TV in the world. In fact, Alon uses some of our source code. I just learned this in Starlink. I didn't actually know this. He's using it's complicated thing we built it was like a switching protocol, and we open sourced it, and it's in Starlink. Like, it's actually the protocol in Starlink that makes Starlink work. Is the BBC thing.
That's amazing. But like, within those big companies, a lot of us, I'm sure, have been there. Like, how do you drive that change? Because that's one of the hardest things. Like, you get bumping into these people, whether you're trying to work with them from the outside, meaning you're, developing products for them or selling to them, or you're trying to change it from the inside. Like, how you've done it over and over again.
Entrepreneur, entrepreneur, 2 totally different things, right? So entrepreneur, I always just said this to someone out here. There's an unending need at big companies for smart people fashionably dressed to provoke and instigate. Like, that demand will never go away. It doesn't matter what tools you use, the job is always going to be there. Mm-hmm. But it's often you do a piece of innovation for a smart young executive who's hungry and wants to get up in their career, and then nothing happens with it. But it is financially very rewarding, but it can also be depressing because we built the first VOD system at a company called Schematic that no one ever saw for Star TV. I knew it. That's actually how Eric knew me, is because he was at Microsoft using Windows Media, and that's how we originally met. And we both were like, this is so stupid. They are never going to release this, and it would transform the business. And so the reason he knew to hire me at the BBC is he knew I could do it, and he knew I could do it at a place that owned the rights. Yes. As an entrepreneur, and this is the thing that people talk about entrepreneurs all the time, but being an entrepreneur is about finding the pockets of goodness and innovation within a company and then creating a landscape for them to flourish. So I often say the change management thing I did at the BBC is when I first got there, Eric gave me 3 tasks, which I now realize is bonkers that he gave me these 3 tasks. He said, there's a bunch of people on the 3rd floor doing streaming media, unify them and make something by Christmas. He said, there's this guy, Matthew Postgate, now the CTO of the BBC. Yes. But Matthew at the time was this like rich kid who couldn't be fired for political reasons, who was annoying him because of this mobile phone idea that Eric thought was a terrible idea. He said, you get him. And he said, and the website is a mess. Can you do something about that all by Christmas? And so as we were doing this, I realized everyone had great ideas. They wanted to build prototypes. No one wanted to ship anything. And so I kept like tucking in, like at first I thought it was a technical problem. We had like an IT services agreement with Siemens and this company Redby. And eventually I was like riding home on the train one night, and I thought to myself, the problem's cultural. They're terrified to fail. And so I set up an incentive scheme right before we launched iPlayer. And I said, every quarter, the 3 most successful projects and the 3 biggest failures, those teams get a bonus. Everyone's like, you can't do that. And like, I literally was hauled in front of the HR council and like given a lecture about leadership development. And I said, we're going to do it for a year. My contract's up in a year. You can fire me if you want. But we're going to do what I'm going to do. And Eric says yes, and I say yes. So that's what Mark Thompson actually finally said, fine. And every quarter we had this process where we reviewed the 3 winners and the 3 losers. And by celebrating the loser, and the loser was key. It wasn't how much money you lost. It was how bold a claim did you make, and did you learn, and could you constructively share the learning? And if you could do those things, you got your bonus. And like, we had some people do bonkers things, but they were awesome. Like, these guys did streaming video on a Nokia. You remember this because it was all.
Yeah.
It was crazy. Like, there's like 50 people with this phone. So like, it wasn't really a success. But like the audacity of putting streaming video on a mobile phone, I was like, yeah, you for sure are going to get bonus for that. And that culture change gave people permission. It focused on shipping, and it gave you permission to fail. Failure wasn't the way to lose your job. Not shipping was the way to lose your job. Right. And by changing that incentive just slightly, that's how we transformed that culture. And it was very intentional. It was I had to think through what I wanted and then make sure all the incentives aligned to get that thing.
And was that what also took you to then lead Daily Mail, which is, again, like that was before they were strong on digital platforms. Like that's another transformation story. Yeah. And now being at the very top leadership of that company.
It's true. So Lord Rothermere, Jonathan as I call him, was one of my biggest antagonists at the House of Lords Media Committee. So because I was one of the top 5 executives at the BBC, I would regularly be summoned to these meetings of the House of Lords Media Committee and other groups, and they would just shout at me, and the trust would shout at me. And I'm American, so then the newspapers would write about it, the Daily Mail being one of them. And I fucking hated that guy, sorry. I really hated him. He was annoying. He was too smart. He would ask smart questions. Everyone else was, I could kind of snow them, but he did his homework. So I deeply disliked this man. And then his office, it was basically sent more as a summons, but that's probably just the BBC Daily Mail filter wasn't very good, so the secretaries talked to each other, and like I was summoned, and I was like, this is so annoying. So I go down there with my briefcase of like papers and trust documents, and I get to his office, and his office is here on the top of a building that now has a Whole Foods in it, and then next to it is Gardens on Glendon, which is Richard Branson's restaurant. Right. It's like this restaurant in a garden on the roof of this building. It's gorgeous. And he's like, oh, come on, we're going to have lunch. I'm like, I did lunch with this man? Like, I deeply dislike him. And we walk out on the Gardens in the Glendon, and we have a table in the middle of that grassy part. There's no one else there. And I'm like, is this a date? You're not my type. And basically, he offered me the job.
Wow.
And he pulled out this piece of paper that he'd had printed out with like all the org charts of all the different digital businesses. And they owned like all these classified businesses in all these countries. And then he had this like shitty online newspaper that had 12 million uniques. And he's like, none of it makes any money. my dad built this business acquiring businesses and merging them together, and we don't seem to have anyone that understands this on the digital side. And I like the way you think. I think you're going to break things. I think you're annoying, and those are all the things I need in a person to lead this business. And I was like, I'm an electric car driving commie pinko terrorist who lives in North London. And he said, we need diversity on the board. I was the diversity hire. It's true.
That's amazing.
I had a Tesla. I was literally the diversity hire. There was 5 Lamborghinis and a Ferrari and my Tesla in the executive parking lot.
One thing that you might not know is Richard also previously produced a film, Who Killed the Electric Car.
Yeah, but many films. Well, I've also done 20 films, oddly, but that was film 13.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
But what was then you also moved on to Samsung.
We'll skip a whole bunch of steps. I did a startup. I got divorced the first time, moved back to Bay Area. After I had my biggest failure as a startup was a company called Promptly. We were a cross between Calendly and Square long before those companies were as successful as they are today. It didn't really work. We sold the assets and I needed a job. And H.S. Kim and J.Y. Lee, the grandson of the founder of Samsung, invited me to lunch at CES that January. And again, I thought we were just having lunch. I was like, that's kind of cool. And they basically offered me a job. And I was like, I don't speak Korean. I don't drink. I think it's a terrible idea. And they convinced me to do it. So I would fly San Francisco to Korea every week for 2 years.
But what took you out from working for those large corporates and back to the startup world? Because I think one thing that happened to you after that was crypto in general, and you were there at the very, very early stages of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a story about how Brock Pierce gave you Bitcoin?
So I knew Brock Pierce from the film business days. Brock had been in a movie called The Mighty Ducks, and he came in for a bunch of development meetings at NPCA, and I think I briefly was attached to a project he was trying to make. I thought he was a nice guy, and we stayed friends. And Brock threw amazing parties here in Venice. And then he and a bunch of guys did these digital games businesses, which I thought were kind of sketchy. But there was a guy, what's the guy's name who was he's like gray hair, fat. Worked for Trump for a while, got fired. Steve Bannon. So Steve Bannon was his partner in one of these businesses. So anyways, Brock did this thing. And at some point, Brock was doing some startup. And he's like, I'll give you 10 of these Bitcoin if you sign on as an advisor for this thing. And Bitcoin at the time was less than $1. So I was like, yeah, whatever. So I set up a wallet. He gives me 10 Bitcoin. A couple of years later, I noticed the Bitcoin had gone up in value, and there was a pizza place here in Venice that would sell you pizza for Bitcoin. So a pizza cost 2 Bitcoin, and I was like, free pizza.
For 2 Bitcoin.
I didn't really take it that seriously.
How much would that be now, that pizza?
$200,000. The thing was, I didn't take it that seriously, but I was really interested in the encryption side of it because I was a nerd. And when I was at Samsung, I left Samsung for a really funny thing. My bosses, HS and JY, were thrown in jail for bribing the president of South Korea. And so it's the first time in my life I don't speak Korean. The executive change has happened in a very strange political thing. I didn't really want to travel to Korea anymore. So I left very suddenly, and they gave me a big bag of money just to go quietly, which I was happy to do. And it was the first time I'd had a moment in a long time to intentionally decide my next path. So I picked 3 things to research. I was like, I want to learn about AR, VR. So I joined the board of a company called Exit Reality, which was a LBE, location-based entertainment company. I started a company called ARC to do advisory and blockchain and looking at that business. And then I joined an organization called the Creative Destruction Lab, which is now one of the biggest deep science accelerators on the planet. And that was really because I wanted to learn about AI. And I knew a lot about it conceptually, but I started taking all these people to lunch to pick their brains. And one of them was like, listen, instead of taking me to lunch once a month, why don't you join this accelerator and you can give people your wisdom and they can learn about the tech. CDL probably was one of the most transformative things I've ever done in my life. I've never volunteered that much time and energy for anything. And yet over the last 15 years, we created a bunch of asset value in companies, but also it was this rollicking learning lesson on tech transfer and deep science. I love technology, but it was really understanding the challenges of taking deep science innovation and making it into companies.
What was your first experience then there, now getting to AI, which I think a lot of
Yeah.
you are here for, to learn about your journey and also your views in that, because you saw most of those technologies before anybody else.
Yeah.
You could play around with
I mean,
them
I think I
early
could tell
on.
this story. Siobhan Zillis, that's Elon Musk's latest baby mama, was one of the other fellows at CDL. She's a dear friend. And she showed me, she was on the board of OpenAI, and she showed me ChatGPT 2.0. And she talked about it to me for like a month and a half. And I was kind of like shoulder shrug. Like I was like, yeah, whatever. Like I've seen a lot of predictive stuff. These are prediction machines. They're cool, but who cares? And she showed it to me, and it didn't work anything like what it looks like now. And I didn't talk for like 5 minutes. It was a really, I haven't been awestruck like that in a long time. And then she's like, what do you think? And I said, I think it's going to destroy civilization as we know it. And she's like, yeah. She got it. I was like, this breaks so many conventions. Up until this moment, technology was a tool. You know, we used to have clubs and rocks, and then we had spears, and then we had steel and swords and bronze. But always, we, the humans, were in charge of the thinking and the ideation and the lateral thinking and the innovation. That was always the human thing. And the tech was, whatever it was always an extension of that, you know, extensional technology, right? And then suddenly there was this machine ideating. That's a human's role in the relationship. And you could quickly see how this was going to break a bunch of conventions. Forget like business changes. It's just like when I saw the internet, I knew it would change music and media and everything. I knew this was going to change things, but also like I was like, as a species, we are going to be deeply uncomfortable with this. This is like not a thing that we are prepared for as humans, is having something we make compete with us in the space of ideation. And that was deeply terrifying to me, also exhilarating. Like poor Siobhan, like we messaged like every day for like a month about this because it like blew my mind. And then watching all these early AI startups go from like struggling to make one little prediction to being able to use these open source models. And suddenly I have a company called, I can't remember the name. They used to be called, his name's Tudor, is the founder. It was basically a social media company. It would plug into your Twitter feed and then write your tweets for you in your voice using something you were sharing. So if you're sharing a press release, they would basically read the whole press release, read your Twitter history, and then write a tweet in your voice. It sounds really useless, but it's actually amazing, especially if you're a big brand. And they'd really struggled to raise money. And suddenly when they plugged into the OpenAI API, suddenly it was like $1 billion business. It was like amazing.
But what changed your view from the first like awestruck, shook, like this is gonna destroy everything, to I'm actually excited and I see this that you want to spend a lot of your time in now?
This is really interesting. Just because it's going to destroy it doesn't mean I look away, right? I've never, I remember when we were recording the Beach Boys record, I would meet, because I work for the Beach Boys, famous recording engineers, and they would tell me they thought I was the devil because I was ruining their craft. They had spent 30 years learning how to tape splice, learning how to lean on the reels to get, they learned all these things that are utterly useless skills. I had just killed those all. And I went to Neve and had them make us these custom preamps for the recording console. And the Neve guys were like, we think this is a bad idea because it's going to encourage that. Encouraging that digital production is not our business model. But because it was the Beach Boys, I could get people to do it. And so I learned that resistance to change never works. And that change is inevitable, and that embracing it and figuring out how to make it your own and use it as a tool to make your reach more exponential or expansive, that's the way to use it.
So how do you approach generative AI as a technology now? You mentioned you still kind of view it from the business side as a tool, but fundamentally, how do you rethink your own life and your businesses?
So my favorite thing about generative AI is I literally use it as a sparring partner. So I'm incredibly neurodiverse. So we didn't really talk about that, but I have learning disabilities. I have dyslexia and dysnuria specifically, but both. I also have an eidetic memory. So I basically can perfectly recall what you were wearing when I met you 10 years ago, but I won't remember your name. And if you give me your phone number, I will mix it up and I can't add. So generative AI is amazing because I can write in the way my brain works, and then it will help me construct it into rational sentences that the rest of the humanity can understand very quickly. And it's an amazing partner in that process. You know, I have this brain
that's part of you.
Yeah, it's like I very quickly went from hating it to being like, oh my God, this makes me so much better at everything, right? Because it doesn't judge all that craziness, and it will help me. It helps build a bridge between me and other people and communicate my ideas and my thinking and so that's like really amazing. I worry because I've now spent a lot of time with the models, particularly around art and music, but also around language. I can now tell when I read something which model you used to generate it.
That's amazing.
They have fingerprints.
Totally.
And it helps being eidetic. And so those fingerprints right now are kind of like big smudgy fingers on a little screen. Like, it's going to get better, but the thing is the inputs into those systems are still very Western, very white, very male.
Totally.
And like, we talk about this a bit in left-leaning publications, but there's no African LLM, right? Is there? Oh my God, Tali, I love you so much. Is there? That's great. I mean, I know it's coming, but like that, these are the concerns I have is like our written language, all of our history has much more multicultural roots because it was slower and there were more inputs. My fear right now is that most of, you know, as a guy building an enterprise software company, most of the tools I use are written by white male programmers who live somewhere 100 to 3,000 miles from here.
In almost every region, there's one strong player like Mistral. In Europe,
Mistral I know. I mean, the Europeans are getting better.
In the Middle East, India, China, of course, there's plenty of them. But you're right, like in the enterprise tool set, they're nowhere close to being as powerful. Yeah. One thing that we want to get to now, which is your startup. You famously called contact data as the most broken data set. And you've decided to do something about it. You've had an idea for a decade. Like, why now?
Probably longer than a decade. So actually, backing up. So my first pocket computer before phones, I had a Palm. I had a Scion. Does anyone know what Scion is? Does anyone remember that company? Yeah. So they made these little pocket computers. It was like a clamshell with a keyboard. It actually had a modem. You could dial up, holding it up to a payphone. Yes, those actually used to be phones. And I use this because I'm so neurodiverse. And I was a young man who wanted to date, and I needed to put people's phone numbers and names and eventually email addresses in some sort of database. And so I used this Palm Scion.
Mostly for dating.
It was a Scion, which got bought by Palm later. And then also for business contacts. So I've had a contact database since I was 16, 17, which is a thing most people didn't have. And I've kept the contacts, right? So I kept just adding on. And I used a piece of software called Echo by a company called NetManage. And then eventually they got absorbed into Microsoft. And I've just had these contacts, and over the last, let's call it 40 plus or minus years, this contact database has gotten worse and worse. And every wave of technology breaks contact data, and yet there's no tools for fixing, cleaning it up. And I began, there was a company called Plaxo that was founded by Sean Parker and a couple other people I knew, that was acquired by Comcast, that was like a social network that cleaned up your contacts, but it got killed. And I tried to buy it a few years later, and they didn't want to sell it. But I've always had this idea that like contact data is sort of broken. I kept waiting for someone to fix it. And then a woman named Marissa Mayer left Yahoo and founded a company called Sunshine. I was like, oh, thank God, someone confident can actually do this. And she released the software, and it's terrible. And it's terrible in really obvious ways, but it also is terrible in that I realize everyone's solving the wrong problem. So contact data, or really I call it, as a broader data set, it's PII, personally identifiable information, is the most common data type in all network world, right? And it's also highly regulated. So this is phone, email, whatever, but it's also like notes on the person. It could be your medical data if you use HIPAA. There's a whole wave of data. This data is the most broken. We store it on local data stores without syncing.
Yes.
So you would never do this in modern software architecture. You would never put this data this way, but it's how we do it. And we think it's good. We're like, oh, I've got my data. This is bonkers, right? And you have no data integrity. In your phone right now, I guarantee you have between 5 and 15 phone books, and between them you have between 5 and 30,000 contacts, and there's for sure not the right data across any of them, probably 30 to 50% data integrity problems, and you just accept it as the situation. And it gets worse when you go to credit bureaus, security databases, the problem becomes really serious later. And so Kimono, we call it Plaid for contact data, but eventually it'll be Plaid plus an LLM for personally identified information, probably HIPAA too. So regulated, secure data sets. And there's a bunch of things that are hard about this. The first one is just connecting them all and figuring out how the deduping and using some really smart machine learning and things to do that. But then there's also like asking questions and having a conversation with a system with your contacts. So you'll be able to say, hey, who's that guy I met at the KINN who does Red Bull, I think? You know, it'll tell me who that person is. But eventually, it's starting to do things like, hey, who in my network knows someone who knows about applying for insurance money for a settlement around my house being burned down, and finding if you know that person, or secondly, if someone in your network knows, having a way of knowing, having that connection and not have it be spamming on LinkedIn. We just filed a patent actually. So the company was originally called Halo 3 because I had this idea of like, Sandra, if you sent me a message, I would let you use any of my contacts. Like I trust you, we've been friends for a long time. So like an inquiry from Sandra to be introduced to someone should just generate an automatic introduction, right? An inquiry from, I'm going to try to pick some, it's not a name, is random dude I met at a party last night. I want to think about the inquiry, I want to think about the person, and I want to decide if it's the right connection to make. Mm-hmm. And random dude on LinkedIn messaging me to have a meeting about investing in his startup, no. It's just a hard no. I don't even need to read the email. It's a very clear no, right? So what if the software could manage those halos of relationship and inference based on the data from my text messages, my phone calls, my calendar, my email, and using all that to really intelligently understand the nature of friendships, relationships, and context. Mm-hmm.
Why now? Like you said, you've had that idea for more than a decade. Like, why now is the time to do it?
Before AI, there was no way to do this. Before ubiquitous cloud computing, there was no way to do this. Before processing power on mobile devices, which includes iPads and computers, reached the place it has. Before the level of state and Node.js and some of the programming languages we're now experiencing, you couldn't do this. Like really all of the things in the world, and Tony, one of our board members, is from the head of AI at Stanford. He's basically like, you couldn't, even a year ago, this was impossible. And people don't often understand why it's so important because especially if you spend a lot of time with the LLMs, you assume this is very doable in LLM. But an LLM is about the homogenization of aggregate data into a unified view. What we're about is specificity of knowledge with 100% revocation
not probabilistic,
and revocation. Like I need to be able to take the data out of the model forever, including all inferences based on that. That's actually forget the technical problem. It's a math problem that's really hard. Yes. So it just changes the nature. So like I'm like, our CTO is actually a CISO, not an AI engineer, because the AI parts of this are interesting. But the real innovations around security model and all of that sort of keeping your data segregated, using knowledge in the aggregate, it's multimodal because some of the things we'll use traditional LLMs for, some of the things we have to build custom. And then munging all those queries on the fly without mixing the data sets and breaching confidentiality.
I think a lot of people here in this room might also be in the early stages because you could not really build a company, as you said, even a year ago, if you didn't have access to those technologies. Like, how are you approaching this? And when you're experimenting, validating, testing, you're still largely in stealth. Like
we're not very stealth
out there, so a lot of that information you're getting.
You can go to our website and sign up, and we will in the next month or two have something for you to play with, which we hope won't break your contacts, but it'll be fun. It's kimono.id. We're still trying to buy kimono.com, but they want $100,000.
But what kind of advice would you have for somebody who's now building with this new technology on the very bleeding edge? You've broken so many things from Pro Tools to video streaming to digital platforms, and now with AI. Like, how do you ensure that in that space you have something that is commercially viable in the market that users can actually use and get value from? So
it's interesting. Like, I love the story of Promptly, right? So I had this problem, which is I had a yoga teacher, and my daughter had an ADHD tutor. There were like 4 or 5 people in my life who I just wanted them to schedule properly with me and send me a bill properly, and none of them could do it. And they were all lovely, but I was like, I'm gonna have to fire all of them because they're useless. I'm going to build software to solve this problem. And we were 100% right about the problem. The problem's still not fixed, although it's marginally fixed now. But we were 100% right. But the execution was too hard because the latent technologies in the space didn't really work yet. And users didn't know they had the problem. And so right now in AI, do not assume a fixed starting point because the technology is changing so fast. Like yesterday, a guy announced a localized LLM model. What's the name of it?
R1.
Thank you. I like neurodiversity. I never know the names of anything. So we played with it this morning. That's actually why I was a little late. We were on the Zoom call that went really long. This is astonishing.
Unreal, yeah.
Like, it's unreal what this guy has done.
Have any of you played with it, R1, yet? No? So you should check it out.
Basically, never underestimate the power of a man and two women in a lab with a server in the cupboard. That's basically what I learned at the BBC. Like, the power of those closely knit units isolated from the rest of the world. Like, if I was OpenAI, I would be terrified right now. Google less so because I'll probably buy them. Amazon, I don't really understand their AI strategy. And Apple, I think Apple's trying to cook something up, but it'll be just about as bad as Siri, so it won't matter.
Wow, that's a pretty good overview of the AI market. One thing that we're going to get some questions from you guys as well, so get ready and thinking, like, what would you like to extract from Richard? That would be helpful for all of us. But one thing you famously said is, like, you don't believe in AGI. Why? What it is, and why do you not believe in that?
So it's really interesting. This is going to get me in trouble. It always does. So AGI, first of all, it's about defining your terms. So to me, AGI is like that character in the Star Trek episodes that is a self-sovereign intelligence, maybe in a human body, maybe not. You know, there's the whole embodiment, subroutine argument. Mm-hmm. I think that we are so far...
smarter, more capable than humans in almost every task.
Here's the thing. Humans are really good at lots of different things. And I've always believed our superpower is the mashing up of things that don't go together. Like, my ability to marry technology and art is unique to me in some special way, and that's what makes me a special person. I'm actually not that great a musician. I'm certainly not that great a technologist, but it's the ability to cross between those two worlds and blend them in an interesting way. Like, some of my favorite musicians, like James Lavelle, Uncle, is one of my favorite musicians. He mixes hip hop, metal, and electronica in a way that no other human being has ever done. Like, that perspective is super unique. When you think about AGI, it involves mixing a whole bunch of things, which we've not seen machines nearly do. Now, that said, I think AI is going to be better than us at a bunch of things we traditionally think of as human tasks very, very quickly. Like, I'm in the middle of I'll be divorced in a month and a half. I've been 3 years in this process. And I've used ChatGPT and Claude for 60% of my legal filings. It's how I know what the model's fingerprints are now, and I kind of know what each one's better at. And what's interesting is my lawyer, I use them to catch mistakes by my lawyer. So I just took the transcripts from the trial, uploaded them in, had it read through our closing argument in writing, make a bunch of edits, then read through all of our filings for the last 3 years, make a bunch more edits, and then provided her a marked up list of changes. That would have cost me 20, 30 hours of time, or if I had someone do it, tens of thousands of dollars. The whole cost was $20.
That's incredible.
And, like an hour and a half of my time.
How do you rethink your own day-to-day as an entrepreneur? Meaning the way a lot of us are spending time in meetings, emails, product, thinking, talking to customers. Like, how do you use a lot of those tools, maybe some tangible things that we can take away from your life?
So it's really interesting. I'm going to say one thing I'm not good at that is a goal I've set for my year. So I have, for whatever reason, a deep reticence with voice-to-text interfaces, which is funny because I was on the board of Spinvox, which is one of the original companies. Yes. But I have a deep reticence to talking to my phone. First, I don't really like talking on the phone to humans, but voice-to-text, I don't like it. I don't know it's like. I know it's a thing where I suddenly realized I was old, but I had my 3 daughters because of the fires. All 3 of my daughters were in my home with me last week. And I watched them all interface with their mobile devices, and they all, voice to text is their principal interface. Yes. And they use their fingers to correct things. And I met this developer we were interviewing last week to hire him, who does all of his coding voice to text. And I am like, they're much faster than I can type. And I can type pretty fast. They're much faster. And I think there's a bunch of interface layers like that. If you look at your life and you look at where you spend time and you look at the things, look for the friction points that are consuming resources of time and mind share, you're going to find a lot of them are at odd inflection points like that one for me, right? And I try and use technology to solve those things. The reason I'm solving context is because for 25 years it's been very broken. The way we move, just to give you a concept of how broken this is, when I was studying computer science in my freshman year at UCSB, there was a new format called CSV that had just been invented, comma separated value. That is still the way we principally move contacts around. It
Context, money, everything.
It doesn't support emojis. It doesn't it doesn't have dynamic fields. It's like a whole bunch of things about it. And then the other one, VCF, Apple helped. Actually, they stole it, but we'll say they helped invent a thing called VCF, which is the other big format. Also hasn't been touched in 25 years. And so the reason this is so broken is because the ways we're still treating it like a 1980s problem when it's a 2025 or 2025 problem. And so it requires rethinking things in modern software. And I think when you think about your life, think about how you can use modern software and modern thinking to change a sort of bias you may hold in your heart. I mean, like I said, like the music thing was easy. I could see that you could make much better music this way. But a lot of musicians didn't. I met a colorist the other day from the visual effects business, and she was like, my job's going is going to go away. And I said, uh-huh. She said, what should I do? And I said, you should get subscriptions to every generative AI platform, starting with Midjourney, and you should spend 20 hours a day playing with them. Because as a colorist who knows Midjourney and all these other things, there's going to be an infinite supply of jobs for you for the next 10 years. Maybe not 20, but it doesn't matter. You'll be retired.
With that, thank you, Richard, for sharing your stories. Everything from buying a pizza for 2 Bitcoin to now on your 20th startup. Check out Kimono, and thank you for joining KINN this morning.